Next, we're going to look at the incident response teams and actions. We'll look at forensic investigation of the evidence. We'll look at liability issues regarding computer crimes, things we have to do to not be negligent and liable. And then we'll finally look at ethics regarding computer activities. So what can we do as security professionals to prepare for the crime before it happens? Probably the most important thing we can do is build an incident response team and an incident response plan. We need to build this team from many different factions of the organization. We need specialized skills in many different areas. So let's take a look at those, the bullets down towards the bottom of this slide. First, we need the IT professionals, because we are, after all, talking about a computer crime. We need somebody who understands the computer, the operating system, the network, file structures, things along these lines. Next, we need representation from management. Why? Because it's management that will decide when we have to report this crime. It's management's decision about all the major steps in the investigation. Third, we need to have someone from human resources, because very often these crimes involve our employees, and we need HR present and advising us as to how we must behave relative to the handling of the employee. Next, we need the legal department representation so that we identify what the legal boundaries are, how far we can go with our investigation, what type of actions we're allowed to take. And finally, we need the public relations department involved in this, because if this does turn into a full-blown legal investigation where we get law enforcement involved, we have to put the best possible spin on these activities as possible. So we need someone from the PR department to help us with those activities. The first thing we need to do when we declare an incident is we need to stabilize the patient, stop the bleeding, and prevent further damage. Only after we stop the bleeding and damage can we begin the investigation. So first we have to stabilize the situation. Now that we've got the situation stabilized, the next thing we do is start to collect our evidence. First, we photograph the entire area. We document everything, including what's on the computer screen, what the room looks like. Don't touch anything, don't move anything. And eventually, once we get the initial filming done, we now will actually open up the computer case and take photographs inside the computer itself. This is all before we power down the system or anything. So the next thing we'll do now is we'll try to gather as much information about the state of the computer that's been affected as we possibly can. One approach is that we dump the contents of memory down into the page file. Now this is done by blue screening the box. In the Microsoft operating system, there are some keystrokes we can implement that will actually force the system to blue screen. When the system blue screens, what we do is we take the contents of memory and we dump it down into the page file. Then on reboot, eventually on reboot, what happens is the system will take the contents of the page file and put it into a file called memory.dmp. What have we just done? We've just recorded what was in physical RAM at the time of the incident. Then we power down the system. This means pull the plug. Now, staunch piece of advice here, recommended advice, is don't pull the plug out of the wall, pull the plug out of the back of the PC. If there's a UPS in between the wall and the PC itself, when you pull the plug on the wall, you haven't shut down the machine. You're running on battery power now for the next 10 or 15 or 20 minutes. And as a result, the system could further degrade. The state of the evidence could degrade. Again, photograph everything, and again, label and document every piece of evidence that you collect. Now that we have collected the evidence, things like hard drives, floppy disks, CD-ROMs, DVDs, things along these lines, we forward these materials, the evidence, to the forensics investigator. In this case, we're talking about a computer crime. This is computer forensics. It's a highly specialized skill, specialized methodologies, specialized tools, and specialized software. The first thing the forensic investigator should do is duplicate all magnetic media. And he's going to do this at a bit level copy. That's an important thing to know. It's a bit level copy of all magnetic media. This is so that he can now analyze bit by bit exactly what the original was. The forensics investigator will never do his analysis on the original piece of evidence. He will always run his forensics investigation on the copies, again, bit level copies. In addition to working only on the bit level copies, the next thing he's going to do is create a message digest or a hash of each and every component on that magnetic media, whatever that was. In other words, he's going to run a hash of the entire partition. He's going to run a hash of each folder. He's going to run a hash of each file on that hard drive. And what I hear from the forensics investigators is they don't run just one hash. They run multiple hashes of each of these. Now, the hash is actually a fingerprint of each of those bodies of information. And this ensures the integrity of the information from the time we've collected it until the time we present it. So we take a hash of each and every element on the hard drive at the time of collecting the evidence, and then again at the time of presenting the evidence in the court. So this proves the integrity that the information contained on the hard drive has not been corrupted, violated, or contaminated in any way from the time it was collected as evidence until the time it's presented in the courts. There are many areas on a hard drive that contain information that might not be obvious to the untrained. The forensics investigator is specially trained on how to identify hidden files, files that are hidden in what's called streams, slack space, malware, deleted files, and the forensics investigator also is trained in ways to extract information from the swap file. So let's talk about some of these in a little more detail. Hidden files are files that have an attribute, the H attribute, turned on, so that they aren't presented on a directory listing. It's fairly easy to turn this hidden file attribute on. You use, in the Microsoft world, you use the command attrib space plus H, H for hidden. There are 4 basic attributes on each and every file in the Microsoft file systems: read-only, archive, system, and hidden. All we have to do is turn on the H attribute, and now that file will not be listed in any directory listing. Another way to hide files on a hard drive is to stream the file into another file. If I have a text file that is 1K in size, and I have my malware, whatever my malicious software is or whatever it is I'm trying to hide, I can use a certain process to stream my malicious software into that 1K file. That 1K file shows only as a 1K file still. It doesn't show the inflated size. Even if this is a gigabyte in size, the file still only shows 1K, even though it contains that entire 1 gigabyte of malware. In addition, nobody knows that file is there except me, and so now I know how to stream that file back out of the 1K file and then implement it as malware. So there's a certain process you can implement to stream one file into another file, and it remains hidden. It's very difficult to identify and detect unless you know what you're looking for. The next type of hidden secrets on a hard drive is information hidden in what's called slack space. Now, before I get to that one, I probably should start with deleted files. Let's talk about deleted files. When you delete a file off the hard drive, the content that is the file isn't actually removed from the hard drive. All we delete when we delete a file is the very first character of the file name on the file allocation table or the table of contents. Each partition has this file allocation table that is a table of contents. It's a list of all files and where on the partition that file is located. And when we delete a file, all we do is replace the very first character in the file name with a question mark. And this now leaves all the content of the file still on the hard drive, but it declares that the space that this file originally contained is now free and unallocated. So if we look for deleted files, all we have to do is go interrogate all the free space on the hard drive, be able to identify the typical header of a file, and now follow that file out, and we can very often reclaim all deleted files from the hard drive. That is, of course, until portions of that file get overwritten with new content. So deleted files are very often recoverable. Now, let's talk a little bit more about this, back to slack space. With slack space, each and every file on the hard drive is written in what's called blocks or clusters. Think of a cluster as a page in a book. And I can only ever have one file reside on a page. So I can never start a page with one file and then add a second file to that page. So what happens is at the end of each and every file on your hard drive, there will always be a little bit of space in the cluster that is not overwritten with the new content. In other words, whatever lived in this cluster before still resides on the hard drive and can be recovered. That last portion of the very last cluster in a file is called slack space. And statistically speaking, 50% of each cluster, the very last cluster of each file, contains slack space. So if a cluster size is 4K, by the way, this is a typical cluster size. If a cluster size is 4K in size, I have about 2K of residual data in slack space for each and every file on the hard drive. Now, recently I ran a survey of one of my computers and I found there were approximately 500,000 files on a single partition. 500,000 files times 2K says I have about a gigabyte, I believe that's about a gigabyte of information in slack space. That's a huge amount of information. So there's a great deal of information can be learned from slack space. Another area that the forensics investigator will be looking for is any malware. This might be a rootkit or Trojan files that live on the hard drive. And again, we'll always try to extract data out of the swap file. Now here there are two terms you have to have clearly understood. This is while trying to trap the bad guy. We are generally legally allowed to entice bad guys, but we're not allowed to entrap bad guys. So let's understand clearly the difference between these two as clearly as we can, because this is a moving boundary between these two. So let's give you the understanding. You talk to your local legal department and let them advise you as to where that boundary actually exists. First is enticement. Enticement is placing a juicy target in the presence of someone that might be an attacker. It's okay for us to do this. Now, what are we talking about specifically regarding computer crimes? We're talking about probably a virtual machine, not a real computer, but a virtual machine that has flaws intentionally designed into them. And when I say flaw, we're talking about vulnerabilities. Why? Because a bad guy who's footprinting and then fingerprinting my systems, trying to break into my computers, will look for an easy target. So we give him an easy target to shoot for. Now this virtual machine should have vulnerabilities that the bad guy will uncover. This makes it a juicy target for him to pursue. Never put anything worthy or of value on your honeypot system. And by the way, that's the term for this computer, or this virtual machine that we're talking about here. It's called a honeypot. So again, a honeypot is a virtual machine that has predefined or willfully installed vulnerabilities, so that a bad guy who's looking at all the machines sees 8 hardened computers and 1 machine with vulnerabilities. He'll attack the easy target. He'll go for the one with vulnerabilities. And again, this is our honeypot. The honeypot has nothing interesting on it, nothing of value on it, but it will occupy the bad guy. It'll draw his attention away from our legitimate servers and bring his focus to this honeypot system. This is enticement, and this is generally considered acceptable. Now, to take this one step further, the next thing we'll do is we'll put the honeypot in what we call a padded cell or a honey net. And this is again a spoofed network environment, so that the bad guy, while he's attacking this honeypot, has the illusion that it's surrounded by an entire network of other systems. These are all spoofed systems. And again, the whole point is to isolate the bad guy, isolate his attacks on systems that have no real information, no valuable data of any kind. They're not even real machines. And we will also try to record as much information as we can about the attacks that the bad guy is throwing at us. This will teach us about the nature of the attacks. It'll teach us how to implement proper countermeasures. And we also may gain enough information that we might be able to figure out who this guy is and now prosecute. So again, enticement is putting this pseudo-flawed virtual machine out there so that a bad guy will attack it and leave the rest of our legitimate machines alone. Entrapment is one step over the line when it comes to legality. In most cases, entrapment is illegal. Entrapment is the extension of enticement. So here we have this honeypot sitting out here, and we're hoping a bad guy will come get it. If we were to go to the IM chat rooms, if you will, the instant messaging chat rooms, and say, by the way, you know, this one company over here they've got this juicy target out there. It's got no patches. It's got no antivirus software. You guys ought to go check that thing out, see if you can break into it. This is now entrapment. If I encourage the attack in any way, shape, or form, causing someone to behave in a way that they might not normally behave, this is entrapment, and this is generally considered illegal. I generally would not be allowed to prosecute a criminal if I enticed and then encouraged the attack. So companies have to be concerned about these following terms applying to them. Let's take a careful look at this. First is a concept of companies need to practice due diligence. Due diligence means the security professionals, the organization, has studied their environment and understands where vulnerabilities and weaknesses lie. Due diligence is knowledge about your environment and understanding where you have potential risks. Due care is the next step. Due care says, now that I understand where I may have problems, I'm going to implement countermeasures to protect against those bad things from occurring. So first I perform due diligence, understand where the risks are, then I implement due care, implement appropriate countermeasures to protect against these bad things from happening. If I do these two things, I am behaving as a prudent person. Now, the prudent person rule is a legal precedence that says you have behaved in a prudent fashion as someone else would given the circumstances you were existing within. These say that if you perform due diligence, due care, and you're acting prudently, you are not negligent. Because if the courts find you negligent, you are almost certainly going to be found liable. So the best you can possibly do is prove to the courts that you have not been negligent. How do you do this? Due diligence, due care, behaving like the prudent person. If you are found not negligent, you at least stand a 50-50 on being found not liable. Because again, if you're found negligent in almost any capacity, you'll probably be found liable. The next thing you want to be careful about has to do with downstream liabilities. You might be the downstream liability, and you may have downstream liabilities. And here's the concept on this. Organizations very often will have network communications going between them. If you have a network communication with perhaps a partner, a business partner, and you are negligent and become attacked and violated, you might be the path that the bad guy can now penetrate into your partner. If they suffer damages, you are a downstream liability, you have been negligent, and you will almost certainly have to pay this company reparative damages because of this negligence. In addition, let's look at it from the other perspective. You're the company, you have a partnership with another company who gets attacked because they are negligent. Through their negligence, a bad guy is now able to penetrate your security controls. They are now the downstream liability. And again, what this probably means is first you've been violated, hopefully you'll be able to pursue financial remuneration for the damages that have been incurred. Next, we're going to look at 3 sets of ethics that are related to computer use. First, we're going to look at ISC Squared's ethics. There are 4 main canons you need to know. Then we're going to look at the Computer Ethics Institute, and then we're going to look at the IAB, the Internet Architecture Board's ethical use of the Internet. There are 4 main canons with ISC Squared relative to the CISSP. In order for you to complete your CISSP certification, you have to agree to abide by these 4 canons. The first canon says, protect society, the Commonwealth, and the infrastructure. Translation, do no harm. Protect society, do no harm. The second canon says, act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibly, and legally. What does this say? This says, be a good person. Do no harm, be a good person. The third canon says, provide diligent and competent service to principals. Translation, be a good CISSP. Do no harm, be a good person, be a good CISSP. The fourth canon says, advance and protect the profession. In other words, improve the security of all organizations that you deal with. It also says, help us sell more CISSP certification exams. But that's a whole other story. So the four canons are, in order, do no harm, be a good person, be a good CISSP, promote the profession. Now, regarding the order on these four canons, if you are posed with an ethical conflict, you should always roll to the highest level canon that affects this ethical conflict. Let's give you an example. Suppose you identify that some cyber crime has occurred. It's an internal thing, yet it's still a criminal act, and it has to be reported to the police. It is now more and more often the law that you have to report this. Otherwise, you are breaking the law. So you are now obligated to report this crime to the police. But it's not your job as a CISSP to report this crime to the police. It's your job to report to senior management. Senior management's responsibility, obligation, is to report this crime to the police. If they say, no, 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 we can handle this internally, we don't want this to get out, we don't want anybody to know this crime ever happened, we're not going to report this, we're going to fix this, and we're going to handle this internally. Here's your ethical dilemma. You are ethically obligated to report this crime, yet your boss says you should not report the crime because he's trying to keep this quiet so that you don't damage the company's reputation. Ethics says do no harm to the Commonwealth. If you don't report this crime, the crime is against the public and you are now injuring the public by not reporting this crime. In this case, you are obligated by these ethics to report this crime even though your boss tells you not to. Downside, you're probably going to get fired. But this is the ethical position that you have to take. By the way, this will be the answer to the test too. So again, do no harm, be a good person, be a good CISSP, advance the profession. The Computer Ethics Institute has produced an ethical standard trying to provide the proper balance between computer use and access to computer resources. So again, Computer Ethics Institute has a standard out there regarding ethics, and just be aware that this ethics standards is there and available, that this body is there, Computer Ethics Institute is there, and is trying to establish these ethical standards. Now, the Internet Architecture Board has a series of issues that they consider is unethical use of the Internet. Remember, Internet Architecture Board is specifically concerned about the ethical use of the Internet. These are rules that they say are unethical. So let's summarize, let's go through this list here. First, it says it's unethical to purposely seek to gain unauthorized access to Internet resources. In other words, if you aren't authorized to be there and be viewing this information, you shouldn't be trying to gain access to that information. Second, it's unethical to disrupt the intended use of the Internet. In other words, don't denial of service routers and web servers. This would be unethical. Third, it's unethical to waste Internet resources through through purposeful actions. So again, don't denial of service any of the resources on the Internet, infrastructure or web servers. Next, it's unethical to destroy the integrity of computer-based information. Don't deface websites, don't violate the integrity of information, don't cook the books on any information on or passing through the Internet. Next, it's unethical to compromise the privacy of others on the Internet. And finally, it's unethical to implement negligence or use negligence in the conduct of Internet-wide experiments. Again, what is this? This is a penetration tester who isn't really paying attention, doesn't really realize what he's doing. If he is pen testing a public website from the external across the internet, he has to realize that he is actually invoking an attack across the internet. He's using the internet to attack a client. Even if it's an approved process by the client, it is unethical for him to implement this across the internet. You should know these standards, these ethical standards presented by the Internet Architecture Board.